The other world wasn't always there. Before the fog, before the rust, before Alessa's suffering split reality apart. Silent Hill was just a town, but something in the land was already awake, listening, absorbing, learning to turn thoughts into rooms and pain into architecture. This is the complete timeline of how the Otherworld was born. From sacred ground to a prison built on suffering to ritual abuse, and finally the psychic disaster that tore the town's reality wide open. Get comfortable. This goes deeper than anyone expects. Please like and subscribe. Now let's begin. Part 1. Introduction. What the Otherworld truly is. Silent Hill doesn't follow normal rules. You need to understand that right from the start. The town has a second skin. That's the Otherworld. It's not a place you can travel to on a map. It's an emotional echo made entirely physical. The Otherworld is a layer of reality that bleeds through, and it's rooted deep in centuries of suffering and dark, strange rituals. This whole story is about how this nightmare began. We have to trace its history all the way back from old, pre-colonial myth up to the terrifying modern hellscape people encounter in the games. The most important thing to grasp about the Otherworld is its real nature. It's a dynamic space. It moves and shifts based on the emotions that fuel it. It's alive in a way a building or a city isn't. Think of the town itself as a living entity. Most towns are just concrete and streets. Silent Hill is different. It's built on something deeper, something spiritual and dark. This deeper layer, this Otherworld, acts as a reflection. It's a terrifying mirror that takes the darkest thoughts, the heaviest guilt and the deepest pain, and it renders them solid. When people talk about a haunted town, they usually mean ghosts in houses. Silent Hill means the entire reality changes around you. That's what the Otherworld does. It takes the subjective terror of one person and makes it an objective, physical threat. You can't just run away from a ghost. You can't run away when the walls themselves become your fear. We call the Otherworld a psychic scar. That's a good way to describe it. A scar is a wound that healed badly. The land beneath Silent Hill was wounded repeatedly over the centuries, and the psychic energy that came from that pain created a scar on reality. This scar never really closes. It stays open, and it leverages the latent spiritual power already present in the soil. The town uses this energy to punish the people who enter, or sometimes it forces them to confront their inner demons in a process the cult calls cleansing. The Otherworld is the exact point where human pain and raw supernatural power violently merge. You see the pain on the rusted metal and the blood-soaked floors. You feel the power when the whole world shifts around you without warning. This concept of a psychic scar is crucial for understanding the lore. It means the Otherworld isn't a simple dimension shift, like walking through a portal. It's an infection. It's a wound that's always festering, always ready to bleed into the normal world. It doesn't follow the rules of geometry or time. Sometimes you walk 10 feet and you're suddenly in the past. Sometimes a hallway that should be 30 feet long stretches out into infinity. It doesn't make sense because it isn't meant to make sense. It's governed by the rules of emotion and trauma, not physics. This emotional echo is why the Otherworld looks different for everyone who goes there. It's personal. It reads your mind, and then it designs a personal hell just for you. If you go to Silent Hill, you're not going to see the same thing someone else saw. You're going to see your own sin, your own shame, brought to life. That's a key piece of the horror. It's not just scary, it's intimate. The town knows you better than you know yourself. The sheer volume of human suffering that went into building this psychic scar is immense. It started small, with the first acts of cruelty and desecration. It grew larger with war, sickness, and institutional pain. It peaked with the ritualistic abuse and psychic trauma of a young girl named Dahlia Gillespie. Every single terrible thing that happened on that land added another layer of energy, another coat of spiritual rust to the Otherworld. It's a cumulative trauma. It's not just one event, it's a history of pain made manifest. We have to remember that this psychic scar is also fueled by belief. The cult, the order, didn't create the power, but they understood how to use it. They fed it with their dark rituals and their fanaticism. They used the town's energy to try and summon their god. The beliefs and the rituals didn't create the place, but they certainly gave the Otherworld its dark purpose. They taught the scar how to punish people. So when you see the rusty metal and the dark industrial feel of the Otherworld, you're not looking at a prop. You're looking at a memory. You're looking at the physical embodiment of emotional torment. It's the ultimate result of human pain, violently merging with a unique, supernatural power. You can't escape the Otherworld until you either accept the reality it shows you, or until the town is done with its cleansing judgment. It's a terrifying, dynamic, and intensely personal prison. We have to now look back at where that foundational energy first came from. This journey starts long before the settlers, with the original inhabitants who first knew the land's power. That's the true beginning of the horror. The sheer scale of the town's ability to change reality makes it one of the most frightening concepts in all of horror fiction. It's always active, always listening, and always waiting. The Otherworld is the final destination for the truly guilty. Part 2. The Sacred Land Before Silent Hill. The land that would eventually become the town of Silent Hill possessed a strong, powerful history long before any European settlers ever arrived. We're talking about centuries ago. The Native American tribes who inhabited the area around Toluca Lake didn't treat the land as mere territory. They saw it as something holy, a truly sacred entity. They gave it a name that tells you everything you need to know: the place of silenced spirits. This name wasn't meant to sound scary or dark in the way we use those words today. It meant the spirits of the ancestors and the spirits of nature were quiet here, resting, or perhaps simply present. It was a site of profound respect, not fear. The most important thing they understood about this location was that the boundary between the world of the living and the spiritual realm was exceptionally thin. It was porous, like a permeable membrane. You could step across it, or you could communicate through it with less effort than anywhere else. The tribes could have seamless communication with the nature spirits, with their ancestors, and with the collective consciousness of the land itself. They recognized that the very soil was saturated with an intense, potent spiritual energy. This energy, they knew, had the power to make thoughts and desires manifest. It could take an abstract idea and give it solid, tangible form. This raw, inherent potential of the land is the absolute foundational element. Without it, the terrifying Otherworld of later years could never have existed. The spiritual energy was already there, waiting. The original power of the land was not something the Native Americans feared or tried to destroy. They approached it with ritual, ceremony, and deep respect. They maintained a delicate, ancient balance with the spiritual energy. Their entire way of life centered on harnessing this energy for communication, for healing, and for wisdom. They viewed it as an essentially benign force of nature, powerful, yes, but fundamentally neutral and available to those who understood the proper rituals. They understood that the energy was a raw resource. They used it for good, keeping it pure and controlled through their practices. This original potency is what distinguishes Silent Hill from any other supposed haunted location. It's not just a place where bad things happened. It's a place where reality itself is chemically designed to manifest internal reality. The land was already primed. The settlers didn't create the power. They only corrupted it. That's a crucial distinction for understanding the entire lore. The land was not evil. It was simply reactive and sensitive. The Native American history tells us the power can be used for positive reasons. They experienced shifts in reality or dream journeys, but these were always intentional and controlled. They sought guidance. They sought wisdom. The whispers and visions they encountered were those of ancestors offering support and direction, not those of demons demanding a sacrifice or tormenting the living. This proves the power is a spiritual conduit, not an inherently evil generator. The lake itself, Toluca Lake, added to the spiritual significance of the area. Bodies of water in spiritual traditions often symbolize transition, memory, and reflection. The stillness of the lake was seen as reflecting the peaceful nature of the silenced spirits. It was a place of rest for the dead, a place for deep reflection for the living. The tribes established their ceremonial grounds right near the shores, respecting the spiritual current that flowed through the bedrock beneath the water. Their entire civilization was built around acknowledging that the land was alive, deeply sensitive, and capable of manifesting realities based on the emotions that were impressed upon it. They maintained a difficult balance, keeping the spiritual conduit open but pure. The disaster of Silent Hill begins much later, not with the appearance of the first monster, but with the brutal, ignorant disruption of this necessary, ancient harmony. That harmony had kept the massive spiritual power in check for untold generations. It was a system of checks and balances that the settlers completely ignored. If the tribes had remained, the land might have stayed a place of healing and communion. It's a powerful counterpoint to the later darkness. It shows us that the darkness was not endemic to the place. The darkness was brought by the people who settled there. They imposed their own violence, their own rigid fears, and their own destructive desires onto a land that was uniquely designed to manifest those exact things physically. The original land was a kind of spiritual paradise, ready to respond to humble faith. The town became its opposite, demonstrating the catastrophic spiritual result of desecrating a holy and potent ground. The Native Americans were the original, effective guardians of the land's power. Their faith was rooted in humility and respect for the natural world. The later cult rituals would be based on absolute, selfish, and violent power. The peaceful place of silenced spirits was the powerful, sacred ground waiting to be corrupted. The true horror isn't that the land creates evil. The horror is that the land simply responds to the most dominant emotional force present. The settlers brought the negativity, and the land responded accordingly. Part 3. Rituals of the First People. The Native American tribes who lived near Toluca Lake developed ceremonies that were intricate, profound, and absolutely steeped in respect for the land's spiritual potency. These weren't simple, primitive superstitions. They were highly sophisticated forms of shamanism, carefully designed to safely navigate the extremely thin boundary between material reality and the spiritual realm. These practices are crucial because they represent the earliest, most controlled ways the land's power was used. They were the original, primitive precursors to the terrifying physical shape the Otherworld would take centuries later. The tribes fully understood that the spiritual energy of the ground could be channeled. They utilized dream journeys and ceremonial communion with their ancestral spirits. They often relied on natural, hallucinogenic plants gathered from the region to aid this process, allowing them to intentionally travel beyond the veil. Their shamans were highly trained spiritual engineers. They knew exactly how to safely enter altered states of consciousness, allowing their spirits to bridge the gap between worlds. Their goal was always to seek knowledge, guidance, or spiritual healing for the tribe's collective well-being. They were meticulous about their practices because they acknowledged the power's immense danger if disrespected. They maintained a rigid spiritual balance, ensuring their interactions did not pollute the delicate flow of energy. Imagine the scene. It's not a scene of chaos, but of quiet purpose. A solemn circle of people near the shores of Toluca Lake. The air is still and expectant. The journey into the spiritual depth was one of consciousness, intention, and great spiritual control. The resulting shifts in perception were not chaotic nightmares. They were intentional visions, usually filled with symbolic meaning related to nature, the tribe's lineage, and the spirits of the ancestors. The environment may have momentarily shifted in ways later residents would recognize as distorted, but for the tribes, it was a distortion of understanding, a way to receive deeper knowledge, not a mechanism of torment. They were successfully demonstrating that the land's energy was manageable. It could be used for benign, good purposes. They were traveling into the spiritual realm before it was utterly corrupted. They treated it like a sacred library, a place to gain wisdom rather than a prison or a torture chamber. This continuous, respectful interaction had a powerful effect on the land itself. It imprinted the soil with a strong baseline of spiritual consciousness. This actually strengthened the land's ability to manifest abstract concepts, but the tribal reverence kept the emotional charge either positive or purely neutral. They were proving that the power wasn't inherently evil, just immensely responsive. The Native American practices were ultimately about acknowledging that the separation of worlds existed, even as they sought to bridge it for specific, controlled purposes. They knew the spiritual realm was powerful and required constant, humble offerings to remain quiet and balanced. They were, in effect, the original guardians of the land's power, actively preventing it from lashing out uncontrollably. Their rituals established the very first spiritual rules for the region. They showed that emotional intensity could alter reality here, that the ancestors were present and influential, and that the greatest power ultimately lay in the conscious thoughts of the living. This foundational set of rules would be brutally overwritten by the settlers, but the basic mechanics of manifestation remained. The tragedy truly escalates when the tribes were violently displaced. This long-maintained spiritual contract was instantly severed. The rituals stopped. The careful offerings ceased. The powerful, latent energy of the land was left completely unguarded, potent, and suddenly subjected to the fearful, grasping, and violent consciousness of the new arrivals. The respectful acknowledgement of the place of silenced spirits was replaced by fear, denial, and fanaticism. This started the long, slow process by which the sacred ground transformed into a terrifying, responsive psychological hell. The delicate balance was shattered forever. The land was then left ready to be infected by the harsh, violent doctrines that were soon to follow. They showed that controlled use was possible, but the settlers would prove that uncontrolled, destructive use was inevitable. Part 4. The settlers arrive and desecrate the land. The delicate ancient balance established by the Native American tribes finally broke in the late 1600s. That's when the first wave of European colonists arrived. They came with their own doctrines, their own harsh worldview, and absolutely no understanding of the land's spiritual sensitivity. They saw the region around Toluca Lake as nothing more than undeveloped territory, ready to be exploited. These settlers did not see a place of silenced spirits. They saw an opportunity for timber, trapping, and a new life built upon their own rigid faith. They immediately began clearing the land and establishing their own small settlement. This arrival and the mindset behind it initiated the long, slow process of the land's corruption. Their first act of spiritual aggression was the disruption of the Native American rituals. They didn't understand the sacred grounds or the purpose of the ceremonies. They viewed the native practices as pagan and dangerous. They forcibly displaced the tribes from the areas around the lake that were most spiritually potent, driving them away from their ceremonial sites. This act of desecration was the first major wound inflicted upon the land. It wasn't an act of violence against a person, but an act of spiritual violence against the land itself. The contract of humility and respect was ripped up. The subtle, constant flow of balancing energy provided by the rituals stopped entirely. The spiritual vacuum created by this disruption was immediate. The land's energy, which had been gently channeled for centuries, was suddenly left potent and unguarded. It was now exposed to the fearful, grasping, and judgmental consciousness of the colonists. The settlers' own faith was rigid and unforgiving, steeped in concepts of sin, damnation, and violent sacrifice. This new, negative energy began immediately warping the land's natural power. The power that was once a tool for spiritual communion began turning toward dark, punitive manifestations. The spiritual field was primed to take any powerful emotion and make it real. The colonists provided a wealth of fear, guilt, and religious fanaticism. The settlers' actions were based on complete ignorance of the underlying reality. They believed their God was the only force that mattered. They didn't realize they were building their homes directly on top of a powerful nexus point, a place where their own deepest religious fears would be reflected back at them. The land didn't care about their specific religion. It simply reacted to their intensity. This transition marks a crucial shift in the law. The spiritual field went from being controlled by the Native Americans' positive intentions to being dominated by the colonists' negative religious anxiety. The settlers planted the seeds of the later cult's harsh doctrines. They established a foundational level of spiritual trauma simply through their presence and their destructive religious worldview. They also began exploiting the resources, particularly the minerals and forests, further showing a complete lack of respect for the environment that the Native Americans considered sacred. Every tree cut, every patch of soil disturbed, every sacred rock moved for construction was another insult to the sensitive spiritual field. The entire spiritual structure of the area was thrown into imbalance. The land was no longer a place of rest for spirits. It became a place of spiritual turmoil. The powerful energy that had been peacefully silenced was now agitated, waiting for a chance to strike back against the invasion. The settlers unknowingly set the stage for their own destruction by bringing their sins, greed, violence, and intolerance to a place where those sins would eventually become physically manifest. The desecration was not just an environmental crime. It was the essential, catastrophic opening move that led to the birth of the dark history of Silent Hill. The spiritual field was ready to respond with immense, terrible force. The colonists had sown the seeds of their own eventual panic and demise on that holy ground. Part 5. The First Great Plague. The land responded to the settlers' desecration swiftly, though perhaps not immediately in a way the colonists understood. Not long after the settlement was established and the Native Americans were driven off, a mysterious, supernatural epidemic swept through the small population. This event is known in the history of the town as the First Great Plague. The epidemic was terrifying and overwhelming. It was unlike any normal sickness they had encountered before. It wiped out large numbers of the burgeoning settlement, forcing the temporary abandonment of the town. This plague was arguably the land's first supernatural response to the settlers' aggressive desecration and their spiritual imbalance. It was the land pushing back against the foreign, negative energy that had arrived. This plague wasn't just a historical event, it was a spiritual one. The event marked the area with a foundational, terrible wound. The sheer volume of death, the immense concentrated fear, and the hopelessness of the settlers became the raw spiritual material that the land would use centuries later to form its horrific reality distortions. The land, which could manifest thoughts, was now saturated with the single, dominant thought of mass suffering and panic. The plague turned the spiritual field from merely corrupted into actively punitive. The colonists had brought their rigid beliefs in sin and divine judgment. When the plague struck, they interpreted it through those very beliefs, cementing the idea that the land was a place of hellfire and punishment. Their fear fed the energy. Their terror was what the spiritual field absorbed and magnified. Imagine the panic of the survivors. They saw their children and neighbors dying from an unknown cause. They believed it was God's wrath or a curse from the savage natives they had displaced. Their intense guilt over their actions against the tribes, mixed with religious fanaticism, created a powerful cocktail of negative emotion that settled deep into the soil. This massive die-off was crucial because it provided the first major source of concentrated psychic energy. Death in a normal place is sad. Death in Silent Hill is potent. Every drop of blood, every dying scream, every moment of fear becomes fuel for the land's eventual power. The plague provided this fuel in bulk. It was the first psychic scar etched into the soul of the town. The fear and death were so intense that the settlers abandoned the area completely, leaving the settlement silent and empty. The memory of the sickness, the fever, the coughing, the bodies didn't leave. It soaked into the spiritual field. That memory remained dormant but active, a template for future manifestations. The plague was the land's first successful attempt to purge itself of the invading presence through massive, violent suffering. This foundational wound is vital to understanding the later aesthetics of the Otherworld. Why does the Otherworld feature institutions and disease? Because institutional sickness, death, and quarantine were baked into the land's memory from the very beginning. The Otherworld is often rusty, blood-soaked, and covered in filth. That look is partly derived from the physical and spiritual residue left by this first great sickness. The plague confirmed to the land that intense negative emotions were the strongest form of psychic input it could receive. It learned to respond to death and fear. It was a tragic, supernatural cycle. The settlers brought fear. The land responded with a physical manifestation of that fear, the plague, which generated more fear, and the whole cycle reinforced the land's dark nature. The abandonment that followed was simply the natural conclusion of this initial, terrifying spiritual conflict. The stage was now set for the land to enter its next dark phase. Part 6. A century of silence. Following the devastating First Great Plague, the land that would later become Silent Hill entered a long period of quiet neglect. For much of the 18th century, the region remained largely abandoned. It became an empty ghost region. The settlers had fled in terror, driven out by the overwhelming sickness and the resulting famine. They saw the area as cursed and forsaken. During this century of silence, nature tried to reclaim the area. Trees began growing through the abandoned, rotting houses. Vines covered the deserted foundations. The roads, which were rudimentary to begin with, slowly began to disappear under layers of earth and wild grass. It seemed, on the surface, that the spiritual field might have a chance to recover and return to its original, neutral state of rest. But here's the thing about spiritual wounds. They don't heal like physical wounds. The terrible, collective suffering from the plague hadn't dissipated. It was still there. The spiritual wound, the deep psychic scar left by the epidemic and the initial desecration, merely festered beneath the soil. It remained dormant, yes, but its potential energy was still incredibly potent. This century of silence was actually a period of intense spiritual marination. The negativity, the fear, and the residue of the plague were left undisturbed by human activity. The town's spiritual field was isolated, protecting this dark energy from any conflicting positive influences. There were no new rituals of respect, no new ceremonies to balance the ledger. There was only quiet, concentrated rot. The land was effectively recharging. The spiritual field wasn't just passively waiting. It was absorbing the residue of the trauma. The deep quiet allowed the land to internalize the pain it had absorbed from the settlers. It took the template of fear, sickness, and judgment from the plague and cemented it into its spiritual mechanics. The isolation was key. If people had returned slowly, in small numbers, with benign intent, the energy might have dissipated. But the land was left completely alone. The lack of outside influence ensured that the dominant energy remained the fear and the psychic trauma of the great sickness. The power was potent, and it was dark. It was simply waiting for the next catalyst. This century of silence serves as a crucial point in the town's lore. It confirms that the power is not reliant on constant human presence. Once the spiritual wound is created, it becomes self-sustaining. The area itself is tainted. The memory of the plague, the religious fanaticism of the settlers, and the spiritual betrayal of the Native Americans were all preserved in the psychic field. Imagine the sheer spiritual stillness of that time. The lake remained silent. The forest encroached. But underneath the silent earth, the wound was waiting. The land had become a spiritual vacuum. It was no longer a place of communion. It was a silent, empty reservoir of latent, dark energy, ready to be tapped again by those seeking power. When the new settlers eventually returned, they didn't return to an innocent forest. They returned to a place that remembered every scream, every fever, and every moment of panic. The town was spiritually poisoned. The long isolation had protected this darkness, ensuring that the next wave of human misery would find a field perfectly prepared to receive and amplify its pain. This dormancy made the later horrors much worse, giving the spiritual mechanics time to perfect their methods of manifestation. The land was ready for its next infusion of suffering. Part 7. The Penal Colony. Birth of Institutional Suffering. The silence finally broke in the 19th century, when the government rediscovered the area. The land, still mostly unsettled and far from established cities, was deemed a perfect place for confinement. This led to the establishment of the penal colony. This phase of the town's history was catastrophic for the spiritual field. It introduced institutional suffering on a massive, systematic scale. Facilities like Toluca Prison and an associated hospital were constructed. These buildings were designed for prolonged confinement, systematic death, and the suppression of hope. The area, which was already poisoned by the spiritual trauma of the plague, now received a constant, fresh infusion of concentrated human misery. The government brought in criminals, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable. These were people subjected to systematic torture, despair, and capital punishment. The institutionalized suffering was constant. Unlike the sporadic violence of the early settlers, this was a steady, measured dose of misery pumped directly into the spiritual field day after day. The sheer lack of hope was potent. Prisoners lived knowing they might never leave. Many faced execution on the grounds. The spiritual energy of the land, which was still dominated by the memory of the plague, absorbed this new layer of pain. The focus of the spiritual field shifted from pure sickness and panic to the darker concepts of injustice, betrayal, confinement, and the finality of execution. This period was essential for supercharging the area's negative aura. The land was already wounded. The prison's system kept that wound weeping. The systematic nature of the suffering made the spiritual residue dense and heavy. The energy was no longer just latent. It was actively hostile, infused with the ghosts of executed men and the despair of the confined. The hospital built near the prison also added a crucial layer to the psychic scar. It wasn't a place of healing. It was a place for dealing with the sick, the dying, and the mentally broken who were too far gone to work or fight back. This institutionalized medical suffering reinforced the original trauma of the plague, giving the spiritual field a dark template for hospitals, confinement rooms, and brutal nursing staff, themes that would become terrifyingly real in the later Otherworld. The presence of the execution grounds was particularly dark. The taking of life, often under harsh or questionable circumstances, became a ritual of finality and injustice. This repeated act of ceremonial death created a strong, defined psychic pattern, that this land was a place of judgment and punishment. This specific pattern would later be leveraged by the cult, the Order, and would also influence the creation of certain executioner-type monsters in the Otherworld. The penal colony years cemented the spiritual field's identity. It confirmed that the land was a massive amplifier of negative emotion. It took the injustice, the fear of confinement, and the pain of sickness, and it bound them permanently to the town's psychic structure. This massive influx of institutional suffering created the dense, potent aura of human misery and injustice that became the new status quo for Silent Hill. When the later cult, the Order, began to form, they didn't have to look hard for energy. The government had done the work for them. The prison and the hospital provided a constant, rich source of power, ready to be channeled. The penal colony was the final, devastating chapter that finished poisoning the well, turning a sacred site into a fertile ground for dark rituals and the eventual birth of the modern Otherworld nightmare. The sheer scale of institutionalized despair made the town spiritually ready for the catastrophe to come. Part 8. The Rise of the Order. Amidst the constant suffering of the 19th century, right there in the shadow of the Toluca prison and the dark, failing hospital, something new began to grow. This was the birth of the Order. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, toxic spiritual reaction to the pain that had poisoned the land for centuries. The people living there, the guards, the struggling shopkeepers, the settlers trying to forget the plague, they were desperate for meaning. They needed an answer for why their town felt so wrong, so heavy, all the time. The Order provided that answer, but it was a twisted, dangerous one. The cult began small. meeting in secret. They were highly effective because they merged two powerful, opposing ideas. First, they drew on the ancient beliefs of the land. They knew about the spiritual potency, the ability of the soil to manifest thought, which had been respected by the Native American tribes. They didn't respect it, though. They just wanted to use it. They took the tribal mysticism and warped it to serve their own brutal ends. They understood the land was a power source, and they sought to tap directly into that source without any of the old respect or humility. Second, they overlaid this pagan power source with their own dark, intense version of monotheistic faith. They didn't worship a kind or forgiving deity. Their god was one born of pain, of sacrifice, and of violent rebirth. They didn't believe in simple salvation. They believed that to reach paradise, they had to pass through an intense, horrifying fire of purification. They called this journey the Way of the Holy Child and other dark names. This merged doctrine was terrifying. It gave the pain of the town a religious purpose. The order believed the town itself was a holy ground, but holy in a horrifying sense, a massive spiritual machine designed for judgment. They used the massive influx of negative energy from the penal colony era as proof that their god was active. They saw the misery, the systematic death, and the injustice as part of the divine plan. This mindset allowed them to thrive on the very suffering that broke others. They didn't try to stop the pain. They celebrated it and fed it into their rituals. They literally believed that the more terrible things that happened in the town, the closer they were to summoning their deity. They began practicing human sacrifice and other dark, complex rituals. They operated in deep secrecy. They knew the land was reactive, and they learned to leverage its spiritual energy. Their rituals weren't about prayer. They were about control. They were attempts to direct the town's power, to force it to manifest their ultimate desire, the physical birth of their god. They saw the spiritual field not as a mirror of guilt, but as a forge where they could shape the deity. The cult's practices often took place in abandoned structures, near the lake, or within the walls of the institutions where suffering was most concentrated. They became experts at finding the weakest spots in the spiritual veil. They knew exactly which memories, which acts of cruelty were strongest in the soil, and they focused their rituals on those points. For example, they likely used the sites of old executions or plague burials to gain access to concentrated spiritual power. The rise of the Order marks the most significant spiritual corruption of Silent Hill. The Native Americans had used the power for healing. The early settlers had infected it with accidental fear. The Order intentionally poisoned it with malice and organized fanaticism. They turned the town's capacity for manifestation into a tool of theological terror. They gave the spiritual field a vocabulary of dark symbols, preparing the ground for the monsters to come. This cult activity was crucial because it provided the sophisticated human direction the land needed. The land itself is just an amplifier. The Order provided the song, a dark, screaming hymn of pain and judgment. They created the foundational mythology that would explain the terrifying things happening around them, binding the natural power of the land to their specific religious madness. This meant that any later manifestations would not be random ghosts. They would be symbols derived from the cult's dogma and the town's history of suffering. The power and secrecy of the Order grew steadily throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They infiltrated the local government, the police, and the health system. They became a shadow authority in Silent Hill. This allowed them to continue their dark, secretive work without interference. They were preparing for the ultimate ritual, the one that would use the town's supercharged spiritual energy to create a literal god on Earth. This long period of growth was the final preparation. It ensured that when the main catalyst finally arrived, the spiritual field would be perfectly configured to deliver absolute terror. Part 9. Early manifestations of the proto-otherworld. As the Order grew stronger and their dark rituals intensified, the veil separating the everyday world from the true spiritual horrors began to rapidly thin. This led to the appearance of the proto-otherworld. This wasn't the full, terrifying shift players know from the later games. It was a period of minor, strange distortions that only appeared to certain, sensitive individuals. It was the town learning how to flex its muscles. Miners working deep beneath the town were often the first to report these strange occurrences. They'd be in the dark, damp tunnels, and they'd start hearing whispered voices when no one else was near. These voices weren't clearly defined. They were fragmented, anxious, sometimes pleading. The men would report sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature, or the smell of burning flesh when there was no fire. These were the first tremors of the psychic field responding to the Order's influence. The land was starting to cough up its memories. Prisoners held in the Toluca prison were another frequent recipient of these early manifestations. Already suffering intense psychological distress, their minds were perfect targets. They'd experience intense, strange dreams that were far beyond normal nightmares. They dreamt of rusting, endless hallways and figures in dark, ceremonial robes. These dreams were the proto-otherworld infiltrating their subconscious minds. The town was beginning to reach out, testing its power to shape individual perception. Early cult members themselves often experienced these distortions. They saw them as proof of their god's imminent arrival. They'd report sudden visual shifts, a clean wall turning rusty for a split second, or a shadow moving in a way that defied logic. These minor visual distortions were like small power surges from the spiritual field. The air was becoming heavier, less predictable. Reality was starting to show signs of instability. The key characteristic of the proto-otherworld was its fragmentation. It didn't manifest fully and openly. It was limited to small sensory glitches or intense mental intrusion. The veil was thinning, but it hadn't torn yet. It required a powerful, sustained catalyst to fully bring the nightmare world to physical reality. The spiritual energy was ready, supercharged by centuries of pain, but it needed a powerful human consciousness to serve as the ultimate lens and broadcaster. The Order saw these manifestations not as warnings, but as encouraging signs. They intensified their rituals, believing they were correctly guiding the spiritual field toward their god. The cult members were essentially collaborating with the dark power of the town, refining its ability to manifest terror. The whispers became clearer. The dreams became more violent. The visual distortions became more frequent, especially near areas of high pain, like the hospital or the prison cells. This phase also introduced the idea that the town could choose its targets. Only sensitive people, people already under psychological stress, or those deeply immersed in the town's spiritual energy, like the cultists, experienced these shifts. Ordinary tourists wouldn't see anything. They'd just notice the thick fog and maybe feel a chill. The town was selective. It was waiting for a mind powerful enough to broadcast the true otherworld into existence. The proto-otherworld was the transition phase. It showed that the town was no longer passive. It was active, aggressive, and highly susceptible to the influence of concentrated belief and suffering. The monsters weren't walking the streets yet, but the raw material for them, the fear of sickness, the pain of confinement, the symbols of the cult, was being prepared in the collective subconscious of the residents. The stage was set, the energy was primed, and all that was missing was the medium. The entire town was a loaded gun, and the Order was about to pull the trigger. They needed a living amplifier, and they were about to find one in a small, young girl. Part 10. Dahlia Gillespie, Architect of Catastrophe. The most important figure in the modern history of Silent Hill lore is Dahlia Gillespie. She was a high priestess within the Order. Dahlia wasn't just a follower. She was a fanatic. She was the absolute, driven architect of catastrophe. She had the religious knowledge, the deep conviction, and the ruthless will necessary to push the cult's agenda to its horrific conclusion. She was the one who saw the necessary path to summon their god. Dahlia's obsession was singular. She was consumed by the idea of bringing the Order's specific deity to physical, manifest birth. She believed this was the only way to achieve paradise, the violent, fiery purification her twisted faith promised. She saw the spiritual field, the supercharged energy of the land, as a massive battery. But she knew that battery needed a conduit, a living medium with immense power, to channel the energy into a physical form strong enough to hold a god. She eventually discovered that conduit in her own family. Her daughter, Alessa Gillespie, was born with extraordinary psychokinetic and psychic sensitivity. This was a rare, powerful ability that made Alessa's mind a perfect antenna for the town's spiritual energy. The Native Americans had respected the land's power. Alessa was naturally resonant with it. Dahlia immediately recognized that her daughter wasn't just a child. She was the perfect, albeit unwilling, medium needed to channel the land's power and birth the deity. Dahlia's belief superseded any maternal instinct. She viewed Alessa not as a daughter, but as a holy, necessary tool for the salvation of the Order. This allowed her to subject Alessa to incredible abuse and manipulation from a young age. Dahlia spent years brainwashing Alessa and subjecting her to bizarre, painful rituals in their home's basement. She was actively trying to cultivate and then control her daughter's immense psychic power, trying to force it to align with the cult's dogma. Her role was absolutely crucial. Dahlia understood the mechanics of the land better than anyone else in the cult. She knew that fear and pain were the strongest psychic input. By inflicting suffering on Alessa, she wasn't just being cruel. She was actively increasing the psychic output of her daughter's mind. She was feeding the spiritual field the most potent kind of energy possible, the pure, intense agony of an innocent, powerful soul. Dahlia wasn't just leading rituals. She was preparing the spiritual infrastructure for the apocalypse she desired. She oversaw the placement of necessary seals and symbols throughout the town. She ensured that the right cult members were in the right positions in the local government and hospital. She was weaving a net of spiritual and political control over Silent Hill, all leading up to the final act. She represents the culmination of all the darkness that had settled on the land. The intolerance of the first settlers, the fanaticism of the early Order members, the institutional cruelty of the penal colony. Dahlia synthesized all this negative energy into one focused purpose. She was the single human will powerful enough to fully exploit the spiritual wound of the town. The entire catastrophe that defines the modern Otherworld rests on her twisted devotion and her complete betrayal of her child. Her motivation, the desire for paradise, was pure in its fanaticism, but utterly destructive in its method. She saw the creation of her god as a necessary violence. She was the high priestess, the spiritual general, and the catalyst. Her plan was set. The final step was the ritual itself, the forced merging of her daughter's psychically sensitive soul with the centuries of accumulated pain in the land. Without Dahlia's absolute, unwavering, and destructive will, the modern Silent Hill nightmare simply would not have been born. Part 11. The Ritual of the Holy Child. Dahlia's machinations culminated in the Ritual of the Holy Child. This was the final, devastating act designed to force the physical birth of the Order's god. The chosen medium, of course, was Alessa Gillespie. This ritual was not about prayer, it was about fusion, the violent merging of two immensely powerful forces, the psychic energy of a highly sensitive human soul and the vast, supercharged spiritual energy of the town itself. The ritual was performed in deep secrecy, likely in the basement of the Gillespie home. This setting, a normal domestic space transformed into a sacrificial altar, underscores the horrible violation Alessa endured. She was chosen because of her immense developing psychic sensitivity. This power was the essential ingredient. Dahlia and the cult believed that by inflicting intense ritualistic abuse and using powerful magical seals, they could force Alessa's consciousness to become the perfect vessel. The goal was to make Alessa into a literal incubator for their god. The ritual aimed to flood her mind with the spiritual energy of Silent Hill. Think of the land as a power grid. The cult wanted to plug Alessa directly into the main transformer. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The combination of Alessa's raw psychic power and the town's accumulated trauma, centuries of plague, prison despair, and dark rituals, began to violently resonate. This process was what permanently linked Alessa's powerful mind to the town's spiritual field. Before the ritual, the land was just an amplifier. After the ritual, the land gained a broadcaster. Alessa became the lens through which the town's spiritual potential would now be focused. Her thoughts, her pain, her fears, and her intense desires became the direct control mechanism for reality itself in Silent Hill. The ritual forced a psychic connection so deep that it became physical. Alessa's consciousness was spread across the town's spiritual geography. Every time she felt pain, the town felt it. Every time she felt fear, the town absorbed it. The atmosphere, the structures, and the very air of Silent Hill were now directly susceptible to the emotions of one small, terrified, abused girl. The immense strain of the ritual, the forced channeling of centuries of dark energy through a single young mind, was agonizing. The cult deliberately inflicted this pain because they believed the god could only be born through suffering. They believed pain was the necessary incubator, the crucible of divine creation. This event is the true point of origin for the modern Otherworld as we know it. The fog world, the rusty corridors, the monsters that represent Alessa's fears. All these elements found their template here. The ritual didn't just summon a god, it created the spiritual mechanics of the future. The town's energy, combined with Alessa's unique psychic trauma, set the final, inescapable stage for the terror players would later experience. The intense power released by this merging was uncontrollable. It was too much power for even Dahlia to contain. The forced fusion of Alessa's soul with the town's spiritual core was meant to be the climax of creation, but it immediately became the prelude to disaster. The sheer agony and the massive backlash of raw psychic force were about to lead to the most destructive event in the town's entire history, forever sealing the town's fate as a place of judgment and terror. The ritual succeeded in making the connection, but it failed utterly in controlling the output. Part 12. The fire that changed everything. The sheer psychic energy unleashed by the ritual of the Holy Child could not be contained. The ritual in the Gillespie home in 1983 was meant to culminate in a divine birth, but Alessa, overwhelmed by pain and resisting the monstrous violation, unleashed a massive psychic backlash. The resulting explosion of uncontrolled power manifested as a devastating fire. This fire was not a normal electrical short or an accidental blaze. It was the physical result of immense spiritual and psychic energy erupting from a single tortured mind. The fire quickly spread, destroying the Gillespie home and tearing through the surrounding business district of Silent Hill. This moment is the point of no return. It's the instant the modern, visible, otherworld nightmare was truly born. Alessa herself survived the fire, but she was horribly, catastrophically burned. She was transported to the local Alchemilla hospital, where she remained. Dahlia and the cult, desperate to save the vessel and complete the birth, kept Alessa alive in a hidden room in the hospital basement for the next 7 years. They used dark rituals and magic to keep her physical body agonizingly alive. This 7-year period of sustained agony is crucial. Alessa was trapped, living in constant, indescribable pain, hatred, and fear. Her immense psychic power was still permanently linked to the town's spiritual field from the earlier ritual. Her emotions were being pumped directly into the land's energy reservoir. This agony supercharged the town's spiritual energy. Alessa's suffering became the ultimate emotional template for the modern otherworld. Her pain created the rusty, blood-soaked institutional aesthetic. Why do we see decaying hospitals and schools? Because Alessa's soul was trapped in a state of eternal hospital confinement and educational religious abuse. The aesthetic isn't random. It's a direct reflection of her internal hell. Her fear of the nurses, the hospital staff, and the authority figures who tormented her became the basis for many of the town's most terrifying creatures. Her hatred for the adults who abused her was absorbed by the spiritual field and turned into the raw material for monsters. The entire town was now operating as a vast, amplified reflection of Alessa's mind. A mind consumed by terror, betrayal, and a desperate desire for revenge against her tormentors. The fire and the subsequent agonizing confinement turned the town's spiritual wound into a catastrophic psychic weapon. The town's power was no longer just responding to centuries of suffering. It was responding to the fresh, overwhelming trauma of one incredibly powerful individual. The fire was the destructive, outward sign of the ritual's failure to control Alessa. Her enduring pain was the engine that would drive the terrifying shifts in reality for years to come. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts anymore. It was controlled by the pain of a single living, suffering soul. Part 13. The Split Soul. The Birth of Cheryl. Alessa's soul couldn't withstand the immense, continuous pressure of the ritual and the resulting years of sustained physical and psychic agony. Her soul, in a desperate act of self-preservation and escape, fractured. It literally split in two. This psychic break is one of the most critical events in the entire lore. One half of her soul remained, trapped in the burned, suffering body kept alive in the hospital basement. This half carried the immense pain, the bitter hatred, and the raw, dangerous psychic power that was fueling the nascent otherworld. This half was the source of the town's growing darkness. The other half of Alessa's soul was pure. It was spiritually projected out of the town's oppressive psychic field and manifested as a baby girl. This child was discovered by Harry Mason, who adopted her and named her Cheryl. This pure half of the soul escaped the pain and the cult's influence, living a normal life outside of Silent Hill. This split had immense, permanent consequences. The existence of two versions of the same immensely powerful psychic entity simultaneously, one in constant agony, the other pure and free, permanently destabilized reality in Silent Hill. Alessa was the broadcaster, the lens for the otherworld. When she fractured, the lens cracked. The trapped half of Alessa maintained the link to the town's spiritual field. She continued to generate the intense negative energy needed to keep the otherworld active. But the pure half, Cheryl, represented Alessa's lost innocence, her desire for a normal life, and her natural goodness. The two halves were constantly, magnetically drawn back toward each other, trying to complete the soul. This magnetic pull became the central mechanism for the plot of the first game. The pull of the pure soul back toward the suffering soul was so strong it eventually drew the Mason family towards Silent Hill 17 years later. The pure half of the soul, Cheryl, was essentially being pulled back toward her point of origin, toward the dark, suffering core she had been separated from. The fracture itself created an instability in the town's energy that couldn't be resolved until the souls were reunited. This split ensured that the reality of Silent Hill would remain fractured and volatile. The pure half, Cheryl, also carried with her the suppressed memory and latent psychic power of Alessa, which would become important upon their return. The birth of Cheryl was an act of grace and self-preservation by Alessa, a desperate move to save a part of herself from total corruption. But it also guaranteed the future conflict. The cult, led by Dahlia, knew they needed the pure soul half to complete the ritual and birth their god. The presence of Cheryl meant the cult still had a chance, and it meant the town would have a new victim drawn into its nightmare. The fractured soul was the ultimate ticking clock, ensuring that Silent Hill's dark history would eventually repeat itself. The town was set up for one final, devastating confrontation. Part 14. The Otherworld fully awakens. Silent Hill 1 begins. 17 years passed after the fire. The connection between the two soul halves, Alessa in the hospital basement, Cheryl living with Harry Mason, grew stronger than ever. This magnetic pull finally succeeded in drawing Cheryl and Harry back to Silent Hill. Harry Mason entered the town, searching for his missing daughter, after their car crashed on the outskirts, and with that action, the final catastrophe began. Harry was simply a father looking for his child. He was completely unaware of the spiritual reality he was stepping into. But his arrival and Cheryl's presence immediately began triggering the long-feared process, the fusion of both soul halves. This reunification process activated a new, massive and powerful wave of otherworld manifestations based entirely on Alessa's concentrated pain, fear and desire for punishment. This is the moment the otherworld, as a player experiences it, truly and fully awakened. The moment Cheryl was physically present near her original self, Alessa's psychic energy spiked, and the psychic scar on reality tore wide open. The town shifted violently into the full nightmare world. The environment immediately manifested based on the contents of Alessa's tortured mind. Harry wasn't seeing generic demons. He was seeing monsters that were visible, physical representations of Alessa's deep-seated trauma. The closer monsters, with their grotesque, distorted female forms, were physical metaphors for the abusive nurses and authority figures who had tormented her in the hospital. The environment was the dark echo of her school, her hospital, and the town institutions that had failed her. Harry Mason's search was the narrative engine that propelled the final spiritual confrontation. Every step he took, every corridor he walked down, every person he interacted with, was part of a larger, subconscious design driven by Alessa's mind. His presence was strengthening the rift. The otherworld was fully active, and it was personal. The town was using Harry as an unwitting agent. His desperate search for Cheryl was forcing Alessa's repressed memories and fears into visible form. He was walking through a living, breathing map of Alessa's psychic suffering. The atmosphere was dominated by the aesthetic of the burned-out school, the blood-soaked hospital, and the cult's influence. The cult, led by Dahlia, was also active. They were trying to guide Harry toward Alessa, believing he was a necessary pawn to complete the fusion and facilitate the birth of their god. Harry was being manipulated by both the suffering half of Alessa, who was trying to stop the fusion and escape, and by the cult, who wanted the fusion to succeed. The Otherworld was fully awake because the two halves of the soul were physically close. The energy was unstable, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Harry Mason's journey became the final stage of the town's spiritual history. It was the catastrophic confrontation between a father's love, a girl's psychic pain, and a cult's destructive fanaticism, all playing out on a stage that had been centuries in the making. The town had waited for this moment since the fire. The true nightmare had finally begun. Part 15. Two Layers of Reality. Fogworld versus Otherworld. When you arrive in Silent Hill, you don't just step into one nightmare. You step into at least two. You need to understand the difference between the fog world and the Otherworld. They aren't the same thing. They both represent a bleed of the psychic energy, but they happen on two completely different levels of intensity. They represent the town's spiritual infection in different stages. The fog world is the fractured, weakened layer. Think of it as a constant, low-level state of spiritual decay. It's what most visitors experience first. The physical town is still there. The streets, the cars, the familiar landmarks. But it's wrong. It's covered in that famous, thick, unending fog. This fog isn't normal weather. It's a physical manifestation of the disruption in the spiritual field. The fog is the veil thinning, a visual sign that reality is unstable and the town's psychic wound is open. The fog hides the gaps in reality. It obscures the things that shouldn't be there. It makes everything isolating, confusing, and cold. In the fog world, the town is still anchored to our reality, but its emotional defenses are down. You might see some minor distortions. The electricity might flicker. You might find streets blocked inexplicably. The fog world is weak because the spiritual energy isn't fully focused. It's just leaching out, covering everything in uncertainty and spiritual instability. It's the constant state of anxiety that the land maintains, the ever-present awareness that something terrible is just out of sight. The fog itself is the spiritual residue of centuries of fear and trauma, constantly hovering over the soil. The town uses the fog as its first line of defense, keeping people lost and confused, weakening their mental state before the real shift happens. Then you have the Otherworld. This is the spiritual field in its full, absolute power. The Otherworld is the full psychic bleed directly from Alessa's mind into reality. It's not a hazy distortion. It's a complete, brutal transformation. This is when the air fills with static, when the lights turn red, and when the walls instantly turn to rusty metal and blood-soaked grate. The change is violent, loud, and final. It's an agonizing transformation for anyone caught in it. It's the spiritual field taking Alessa's hatred, her pain, and her deepest psychological trauma, and broadcasting it at full volume. The transition between the two layers is the key moment. It's never subtle. You'll be in a normal school in the fog world, and then the air fills with that awful siren sound. That sound is the alarm. It's the signal that the town is tearing reality apart. The change happens in seconds. Clean hallways become rotting. Filthy corridors. Bright lights vanish, replaced by the dark, oppressive red light. The transformation sequences show the physical matter of the town instantly rewriting itself to match Alessa's internal prison. The peeling paint, the decay, the constant sense of industrial confinement. That's all Alessa's mind made real. The fog world represents the town's history. the underlying trauma and psychic scar left by the settlers, the plague, and the penal colony. It's the collective memory of suffering. It's passive and ambient. The Otherworld represents the town's catalyst, the active personal trauma of Alessa Gillespie. It's aggressive and intensely subjective. The shift from fog to Otherworld is the spiritual field being taken over by the mind of the trapped girl. She grabs the control and floods the world with her pain. Understanding this dual layer is vital. If you only see the fog world, you're dealing with the town's general malaise. If you enter the Otherworld, you are now locked into the personal hell of the central psychic entity, Alessa, or whichever mind is currently acting as the primary broadcaster. The Otherworld isn't a simple, dark parallel. It's the physical embodiment of one soul's deep, unrelenting cry of agony. The fog makes you lost. The rust makes you trapped. The whole system is designed to break down your mental defenses until you are ready to face the absolute horror of your own soul. The constant, aggressive static on the radio, that's the sound of the friction between these two layers. The sound of reality screaming as it tears itself apart over and over again. Part 16. How the Town Reads. The mind's silent hill isn't just a physical place you visit. It's a massive, supernatural psychic mirror. It reacts to visitors by shaping its environments, its monsters, and its very atmosphere around their deepest traumas, their greatest fears, and their most repressed sins. The town doesn't generate horror randomly. It reads you, and then it builds your personal hell right there, in real time. The process starts when a powerful or guilty soul enters the town's psychic field. The town's spiritual energy, which has been supercharged by centuries of suffering and Alessa's continuous agony, acts like a sensor. It doesn't see your face or your clothes. It penetrates your subconscious mind. It sifts through your memories, your guilt, and the dark things you've tried to forget. It's looking for the weakest points, the psychological scars that define you. Once it finds the deepest trauma, the town uses the raw spiritual material available in the Otherworld to construct your subjective reality. This is why the horror is always so unique to the main characters. Take James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2. He was carrying the massive, repressed guilt of having murdered his sick wife. The town didn't give him Alessa's fire demons. It gave him the red pyramid thing, a manifestation of the executioner and punishment he knew he deserved. It gave him the mannequins and the lying figures, which represented his frustrated desires and his wife's illness. Everything was tailored to his sin. The town is fundamentally a tool of judgment. It forces visitors to confront their inner demons. It doesn't allow denial. It physically manifests the truth the visitor is trying desperately to ignore. If you feel overwhelming shame about an abuse you suffered, the town might manifest monsters that resemble the perpetrator or the trauma itself, forcing you to look at the pain you buried. If you are deeply bigoted, the town might manifest warped religious symbols to expose the fanaticism. The architecture itself changes based on your memory. If the most traumatic event of your life happened in a school, the town will use its physical structures, like Midwich Elementary in the first game, and warp them into a terrifying echo of your pain. The town physically rearranges its rooms, its hallways, and its institutions to match the psychological map of the person it is judging. The town's immense psychic energy is flexible. It bends reality to fit the internal narrative of the person whose consciousness is acting as the lens. This process ensures that the terror is always deeply intimate. The horrors in Silent Hill are not designed to scare you generally. They are designed to shame you specifically. They are the physical evidence of your guilt. The town knows that the worst demons aren't the ones that come from hell, but the ones you create for yourself in your own mind. The land simply provides the stage and the paint. The key mechanism is the manifestation of belief. The town takes a belief, be it Alessa's belief in institutional torment, James's belief in his own guilt, or the cult's belief in a demanding, violent god, and it makes it real. The reality distortion is a powerful, amplified feedback loop. Your fear manifests a monster. That monster increases your fear, and that increased fear makes the environment more hostile. That's how the town maintains the high level of horror. You are actively participating in the creation of your own personal nightmare by simply being afraid of the things you've done. Part 17. Harry Mason's role in strengthening the rift. Harry Mason's entrance into Silent Hill was the event that fully opened the rift, and his subsequent journey became the force that kept the psychic link strong. Harry was just a man looking for his daughter, Cheryl, but his presence was essential to the town's ultimate catastrophe. He was an unwitting agent who was constantly strengthening the town's spiritual field simply by trying to be a hero. Harry's primary role was to act as the catalyst for fusion. His search brought Cheryl, the pure half of Alessa's soul, back into physical proximity with the suffering half trapped in the hospital. The stronger the proximity, the harder the two halves tried to merge, and the more volatile the town's spiritual energy became. Harry's very presence intensified the spiritual friction that was tearing the town apart. He was unknowingly tightening the spring that was about to launch the full-scale Otherworld into reality. As Harry moved through the town, his emotional state, desperation, confusion, and fear for his daughter was constantly being absorbed by the psychic field. This wasn't necessarily negative energy, but it was powerful, intense emotion, which is exactly what the land feeds on. The town was reading his desire to find his daughter, and it used that simple, pure motivation to propel him forward through Alessa's maze. He was being guided, sometimes by the cult, and sometimes by Alessa's own fragmented desire for rescue and protection. Harry's actions, therefore, forced the manifestations of Alessa's memories, fears, and pain into visible form. Every time he solved a puzzle or opened a door, he was essentially delving deeper into Alessa's mind. The monsters he fought were not aimed at his personal guilt, like the monsters James faced. They were manifestations of Alessa's pain, the abuse, the fire, the oppressive adult figures. Harry was fighting the physical echoes of a trauma that wasn't his own. His struggle gave those monsters substance and permanence. His struggle also inadvertently empowered the cult. The more he fought and the deeper he went, the closer he got to achieving the final fusion, which was Dahlia Gillespie's ultimate goal. Dahlia and the cult were actively trying to manipulate him, using the promise of finding Cheryl to push him further into the core of Alessa's agony. Harry was a necessary pawn in their ritualistic game. His actions were providing the narrative and the kinetic energy needed to push the climax forward. In essence, Harry's journey through the first Silent Hill game was the process of the Otherworld consolidating its power. By seeking Cheryl, Harry was forcing the final stages of the original cult ritual to completion. He was forcing the final fusion of the soul halves, the ultimate goal of the cult, which would result in the birth of the incubator, the Order's god. Without Harry's relentless pursuit, the soul halves might have remained separate, and the Otherworld might have eventually receded back into a dormant fog world state. Harry's love for his daughter, tragically, was the final, devastating ingredient needed to fully activate the most terrible aspects of the town's psychic wound. He was the unwitting hero who completed the villain's plan. Part 18. The Incubator. The God takes shape. The ultimate aim of the Order was always the physical manifestation of their deity. This god, often referred to as the incarnate god or the incubator, was the central focus of Dahlia Gillespie's decades of dark plotting. This was not a pre-existing demon summoned from another dimension. This god was a thing of the town's own making, a divine entity forged from human pain and immense spiritual power. The god began to take shape within the Otherworld itself, fueled entirely by the continuous, unbearable psychic agony of Alessa Gillespie. Alessa's soul, trapped and burning in the hospital basement, was the engine. Her overwhelming pain was the raw material, and the town's spiritual field was the forge. The deity was being grown inside her mind, using her psychic energy as its fuel source and its physical template. The incubator name is literal. Alessa was the unwilling, perpetual incubator for the divine being. The god was growing like a spiritual fetus inside her consciousness, feeding on her suffering. The Order believed that only pain of this magnitude, the intense agony of a tortured saint figure, was pure enough to house the divine. They saw the suffering as purification, the necessary fire to forge their deity. The god manifests through human torment. This is the key insight. The deity is not a benevolent creator. It is a punitive, violent god of fire and judgment, because that is what the Order believed it to be, and that is what Alessa experienced it to be. The deity is the ultimate, massive manifestation of the spiritual wound, the collective trauma of the town's history, all channeled through the lens of Alessa's specific hatred and pain. The god's final physical form is typically grotesque and often resembles a deformed, fiery humanoid. This form is a reflection of the culmination of all the abuse and horror focused on Alessa. The incubator is the ultimate proof that in Silent Hill, belief combined with suffering creates reality. The Order's belief gave the god its purpose, purification, paradise, and Alessa's agony gave the god its power and its terrifying physical shape. The process of the god taking shape was directly visible in the heightened horror of the Otherworld. As the incubator grew stronger inside Alessa, the Otherworld grew more aggressive, more saturated with blood and rust, and its monsters became more defined and violent. The growth of the god was directly proportional to the intensification of the nightmare reality. The ultimate goal of the fusion, the merging of the two halves of Alessa's soul, was to provide the final, complete vessel for this incubator. The cult needed both the purity, Cheryl, and the immense power, Alessa, to create a perfect physical shell for their god to be born into the world. Harry Mason's actions in the first game were unknowingly accelerating this final gestation period. The terrifying truth of the god is that it is a spiritual parasite, feeding on the most profound suffering the town could produce, ready to be birthed into reality. Part 19. The Collapse of Dahlia's Ritual. Despite all of Dahlia Gillespie's plotting, her decades of cruel manipulation, and the immense suffering she inflicted, her ritual ultimately collapsed. It failed to achieve its final, controlled outcome. This failure was due entirely to the resilience and defiance of Alessa herself. Alessa, even trapped and burning in continuous agony for 7 years, possessed an immense, defiant will. She was an unwilling vessel. Her core desire was not to birth the monster that represented her tormentor's cruel religion. Her desire was to stop the ritual, to escape the suffering, and to prevent the monstrous god from entering the world. When Harry Mason brought the second, pure half of her soul, Cheryl, back into the town, Dahlia thought she had won. The fusion was complete. The incubator was ready to be born, but Alessa, now whole and possessing immense psychic power again, used that strength to rebel. She used the power that was meant to birth the god to fight back against the process. This final, desperate rebellion by Alessa caused a massive spiritual overload. The Otherworld, which was already highly volatile, destabilized completely. Reality began to tear itself apart as the forces of the cult's dogma and Alessa's defiant will clashed. The collapse of the ritual wasn't a quiet moment. It was a terrifying cataclysm of psychic energy and spiritual warfare. The destabilization caused the Otherworld and the fog world to violently merge. The clear delineation between the two dimensions broke down. The town became a chaotic, fluid nightmare where reality was constantly shifting. This climax is where Harry Mason finally confronted the cult and the physical manifestation of the god, the incubator. Alessa used the last of her unified psychic power to eject the incubator from her body. The god was born prematurely, incomplete, and weak. This was Alessa's final, desperate act of defiance against her tormentors. She successfully sabotaged the final stage of the cult's plan, preventing the full, controlled birth of their powerful deity. In the aftermath, the incubator was defeated. Dahlia Gillespie was killed, and Alessa, finally free of her torment, used her remaining energy to give Harry Mason the purified soul of the baby she had just birthed. A new, purified reincarnation. This act of grace was her final legacy. The collapse of the ritual didn't stop the town's power, but it shattered the cult's control over it. It prevented the worst-case scenario, a fully empowered, malevolent god walking the earth. It proved that human will, even in the most extreme suffering, could still fight back against the monstrous forces the town generates. The spiritual field was left damaged, volatile, and permanently open, but the immediate threat of the cult's ultimate triumph was over. Part 20, Silent Hill. 3. Heather's Awakening and the Rebirth of the Otherworld. The story didn't end with Alessa's rebellion and the final confrontation in Silent Hill 1. It simply transformed. The new baby given to Harry Mason was Heather Mason, the purified reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie. Heather was raised outside of the town, shielded from the cult and its influence, living a normal life. However, Heather wasn't just a normal girl. She carried two devastating spiritual burdens. First, she was the purified soul of Alessa, meaning she still had an immense latent psychic power. Second, and far worse, she carried the god fetus inside her. Before Alessa died, she partially birthed the Order's incomplete god, and that spiritual seed was transferred into Heather upon her rebirth. Heather was the living, walking vessel for the cult's god, completely unaware of the spiritual bomb ticking inside her. The events of Silent Hill 3 begin when the surviving members of the Order, now led by Claudia Wolf, discover Heather's location. Claudia's goal was simple: force Heather to embrace her identity as Alessa and induce the birth of their god. Claudia and the cult targeted Heather, subjecting her to psychological stress and fear to prime her psychic energy. As Heather became emotionally stressed, her immense psychic power began to react violently with the dormant spiritual field of Silent Hill. Her emotions and trauma were actively rebuilding the Otherworld. The physical town she visited, which was still tainted by the original spiritual wound, began to shift and manifest based on her fears. Heather's Otherworld was different from Alessa's. It was still characterized by rust and decay, because the town's foundation was unchanged, but the specific themes were her own. The monsters were born from her subconscious fears, anxieties, and the guilt she felt over being a separate entity from her birth mother. Her psychic energy, the same powerful energy Alessa possessed, was actively strengthening the rift, forcing the town to shift from the fog world into the fully manifest nightmare world. Heather's journey was the rebirth of the Otherworld. It confirmed that the spiritual field would automatically attach to and amplify the most powerful psychic consciousness present, especially one so closely tied to the town's original history. The town was not a one-time spiritual event. It was a self-correcting machine, always seeking a new psychic lens to channel its darkness. The climax of Silent Hill 3 was Heather's confrontation with the cult and the ultimate decision regarding the god inside her. She ultimately succeeded in expelling the god fetus and defeating the physical manifestation of the deity, using a ritual and an item, the Aglaophotis, that neutralized the spiritual poison. She survived, but her experience confirmed that as long as the town's spiritual wound remains open, the threat of the Otherworld and the cult's god will always linger, waiting for the next catalyst. The town has a memory, and it never forgets a powerful psychic connection. Part 21. Why the Otherworld Never Dies. We've traced the history of Silent Hill from the sacred land of the Native Americans all the way through the fire and the rebirth in the later games. This journey leads us to one final, inescapable question. Why does the Otherworld never die? Why, even after Alessa is gone and the cult's plans have been repeatedly foiled, does the town's spiritual infection remain permanently active? The answer is simple but devastating. The Otherworld remains because the town's spiritual wound, the psychic scar we defined at the very beginning, is too deep and too profound to ever heal naturally. The sheer, concentrated volume of centuries of violence, ritual, institutional suffering, and psychic trauma has permanently altered the spiritual composition of the soil. The town is fundamentally, spiritually broken. The Native Americans established the land's power to manifest thought. The settlers introduced violence and fear. The plague provided the first massive injection of suffering. The penal colony then systematized that suffering. The cult then channeled all that negative energy for decades of ritualistic abuse. Finally, Alessa's prolonged, catastrophic agony supercharged the entire field. That's a chain of continuous trauma, spanning hundreds of years. The town's reality-altering mechanism is now self-sustaining. It doesn't need an external god, a powerful ritual, or even a living psychic like Alessa to function at a baseline level. The spiritual field has been so deeply imprinted with pain, judgment, and fear that it automatically defaults to the fog world, the low-level state of chaos and instability. That spiritual residue has become the new normal for Silent Hill. Even if all the cult members died, and even if no psychic with Alessa's power ever set foot there again, the town would remain tainted. It has learned how to read the minds of ordinary visitors and manifest their lesser traumas, while the full, aggressive Otherworld requires an amplifier, like Alessa or Heather. The constant presence of the spiritual wound ensures that the veil remains perpetually thin, always ready to bleed the dark energy into reality. The town itself is a massive spiritual sponge. It absorbs suffering and uses that suffering to punish the guilty or torment the vulnerable. The psychic scar means the town is operating under a new, dark set of rules. Fear is manifest, guilt is judged, and reality is subjective. These rules are now hardwired into the land itself. The Otherworld, therefore, is not a supernatural occurrence that can be turned off. It is the permanent, living consequence of the historical and spiritual corruption of a uniquely powerful piece of land. It is the echo of the past made physical. It is the ultimate verdict on human cruelty and fanaticism, forever preserved in blood, rust, and fog. The town is perpetually ready for the next cycle of suffering, confirming that the spiritual nightmare will continue as long as human conscience and guilt exist to feed it. Part 22. Final verdict. What truly created the Otherworld? We've covered the entire timeline now. We started with the peaceful spirits and ended with the violent birth of a dark god. All this history leads us to one single, final conclusion. You can stop thinking about the town as a place you visit. You need to understand that the Otherworld is not a place. It's something much simpler and much more terrifying. It is a wound. This wound isn't an open gash on the ground. It's a psychic scar made physical. It's the spiritual residue of centuries of terrible human history. Every act of spiritual desecration, every death from the plague, every moment of despair from the penal colony, every dark ritual performed by the Order, and every single second of agony inflicted upon Alessa Gillespie. All of that pain accumulated. It soaked into the ground around Toluca Lake. The land itself, which was already powerful and sensitive, simply absorbed it all. The horror of Silent Hill is not that demons came from hell. The horror is that we, as humans, created the environment for our own demons to exist. The town is nothing more than a powerful amplifier. It took the Native Americans' ability to manifest thought and twisted it. When the settlers arrived with their rigid beliefs in sin and punishment, the land learned how to judge. When the cult brought fanaticism and sacrifice, the land learned how to demand blood. The Otherworld is a living echo of that whole destructive history. The fog is the confusion. The rust is the decay and the institutional cruelty. The monsters are the physical representations of guilt and pain. The whole nightmare reality is just the past refusing to die, constantly bleeding into the present. It's the town's spiritual defense mechanism. It pushes people away with fear, or it forces them to confront the guilt they carry. This is why the Otherworld never stops. The spiritual damage is too complete. The town's sensitive core has been permanently infected by the worst of human nature. You can defeat the god. You can kill the cult members. But you cannot erase the spiritual history. That history is fixed in the soil. It ensures that the spiritual field remains unstable, volatile, and perpetually ready to react. The moment you, as a visitor, step into Silent Hill, the town scans your consciousness. If you carry enough repressed guilt or intense emotional trauma, the town immediately latches onto you. It uses the massive reservoir of dark energy from its history to build your specific personal hell. It mirrors your soul. It's the ultimate psychological test. So the final verdict is simple. The Otherworld isn't a random dimension. It is the inescapable reality that your own inner demons, when placed upon a stage so perfectly prepared by centuries of violence, will become solid. It is the final, terrifying truth that in Silent Hill, the deepest horrors are those that are rooted deep within the soil and deep within the human heart. That scar will never close.